Welcome to MacroHive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. MacroHive uses natural and artificial intelligence to educate investors and provide actionable insights for all markets, from rates to FX to commodities. For our latest insights, visit macrohive.com. Before I start my conversation with this episode's guest, I have 3 requests. First, please make sure to subscribe to this podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave some nice feedback and let your friends know about the show. My second request is that you sign up to our free weekly newsletter that contains market insights and unlocked content. You can sign up for that at macrohive.com. Finally, and my third request is that if you are a professional or institutional investor, do get in touch with me. We have a very high-octane strategy and analytics offering that includes access to our world-class strategy team, market views, AI models, and much, much more. You can email me at bilal@macrohive.com, or you can message me on Bloomberg for more details. Now, on to this episode's guest, Sangeet Paul Choudary. Sangeet is the best-selling co-author of Platform Revolution and author of the new book, Reshuffle. He has advised leadership teams at over 40 Fortune 500 companies, including Nestlé, ExxonMobil, Daimler, ING, and Booking.com. Sangeet currently serves as a senior fellow at the University of California, Berkeley, and has spoken at global forums such as the G20 Summit, World50 Summit, and the World Economic Forum. Now, on to our conversation. Greetings and welcome, Sangeet. It's fantastic to have you on the podcast show.
Thank you, Bilal. Really looking forward to this.
Great. And first of all, congratulations for your recent book, Reshuffle, Who Wins When AI Restacks the Knowledge Economy. I read it recently, and it's a really, really good and powerful book. And I think it's much needed for the world we're in right now.
Thank you so much.
Now, before we go into the book and other topics, I did want to ask you something about your origin story. You know, what did you study at university? Was it inevitable you'd end up in kind of management and academia and advisory that you've been doing ever since?
I don't think it was inevitable, but my training certainly helps me get literate at the topics that I look at. So I did my undergraduate in computer science, and that was back in the early 2000s. So pretty much the previous, towards the middle or the end of the previous AI winter. I then did my MBA, and so that gives me, a footing in economics. But a lot of what I look at sits sort of at the intersection of economics and systems thinking. So it's a lot of it is more around ideas that have really gained ground, not when I was being trained, but ever since. And so I think what the direction that led me to was big tech and working within big tech initially, but then I started with product management, moved into investing within big tech, and then realized that there were these bigger shifts happening that people were not fully seeing. They were seeing parts of it. They were seeing very specific elements of it, but they were not seeing a really larger thesis on how winners and losers get moved around with technological shifts. And that's what really kind of prompted me to move into doing what I do now. I've always enjoyed writing, so I'm glad that I get to do that all the time now.
Yeah, that's great. And, one of the things I found with your book was that the way you framed this AI revolution that we appear to be going through is that it's not just simply about automation. In fact, I think your first chapter is something called Beyond Automation. I guess what most people, when they think about AI, they just apply the old paradigm of tech. It's just another tech innovation. So what will happen is you'll just make certain processes more efficient. There'll be some winners and losers in those jobs, and then you move on to the next tech revolution. But you seem to be saying something else. So can you talk more about what you mean by beyond automation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that 3 main arguments that I want to make over there, which are sort of interrelated. The first argument, which I make in the introduction of the book, is that intelligence of AI, whether you have a 5th grader in your pocket or a PhD in your pocket, which is how the new models are positioned, is important, but it's not the central factor that determines the impact of AI. The central factor is how the socio-technical system, the larger, system of workflows and processes and users and value creation aligns itself around the capabilities of the new technology. So the first key shift that I'm trying to talk about is moved from thinking about when do we get to AGI to really thinking about how do we exploit and reorganize economic activity around the capabilities of the technology as it exists today. To make that point, I take the example of the container and how it reorganized the shipping container, how it reorganized economic activity in the industrial age with, in the industrial economy with moving us from localized manufacturing to global supply chains. And the real impact of the shipping container did not take place just in automation of the port, but in reorienting economic activity at a global scale, gave us today's globalization, and gave us component level competition in manufacturing, which led to even more product innovation. The point that I'm trying to make over there is when we think about AI, very often we're stuck with this idea of AI as a mechanism for automation, which is we think about the impact of AI on tasks. And that's the third related point that I make. We think about the impact of AI on tasks. We look at, whether it's our jobs or our workflows, we look at tasks, we break those things into tasks, and we see what AI can do better, faster, cheaper, and hence where can it automate versus augment. What we fail to understand is that the value of AI does not, or the impact of AI does not play out only at the level of tasks. Tasks sit inside larger workflows through which value is created. Workflows are organized into different organizational forms through which firms compete. And then firms compete in different contexts today. They're not fixed industry boundaries anymore. And so AI has an impact at all those levels. It changes the boundaries of the industry. It changes where firms compete and how firms compete. It changes which capabilities of firms will value as the logic of competition will shift. And hence, it's not just the impact of AI on tasks, and hence not just automation, but how it changes the entire system and how economic activity gets re-coordinated around the capabilities of AI. And one final point that I'll just make over there is that we often think of AI as a substitute for labor, and hence we look at the impact of AI in terms of labor productivity, etc. But AI, a better way to think about AI is to first think about it as a new way to coordinate economic activity, and secondly, as a way to reduce uncertainty in capital allocation. And the value of AIs, really shows through in those forms rather than in local automation and productivity gains only.
Those are great points. And, I guess one thing that kind of is very relevant right now is that people are looking at jobs data, trying to work out who's losing their jobs. We've had some economic data over the course of this year that shows that, people in tech sector are losing their jobs. So people are zooming in to say, okay, coders are the losers here. And then at the same time, when you look at productivity data, you aren't really seeing a surge in productivity. There is some signs of productivity picking up, but it's unclear whether it's like a meaningful surge. So when you hear things like this, what an economist would say, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, those are two big questions, right? So one question is, the second question is what I interpret as, how do you think about the ROI on AI, right? What should you be looking at to see whether all of this is really having an impact? And I'll just throw out a few frames of how to think about it. The first thing is that a lot of our focus today is on productivity gains, and it's happening not just at an economic level, but we're trying to find productivity gains at an individual company level. And the problem with looking purely at productivity gains based on a third-party tool provider, in this case the AI model providers, is that those productivity gains eventually get whittled out at the level of usage and accrue entirely to whoever is providing the tools. So it's certainly, tool adoption in itself is not going to give you the productivity gains that you are looking to see. But more importantly, I believe that productivity gains is the wrong place to be looking for the impact of AI. When we think about predictive AI, which is what a lot of machine learning is, for instance, I believe the real value of predictive AI comes through in reducing uncertainty and hence improving ROI on capital allocation. And one of the examples I give in the book is how it's playing out in mining, where there's a company called Earth AI that uses predictive AI to determine new greenfield mining deposits, and then verifies and validates those deposits very quickly, and on the basis of that, it captures mineral rights to those deposits, and it's able to identify greenfield deposits and verify them at with a level of certainty that is 25 times better than what what was the base case. And so that's an example where you're reducing uncertainty, and hence you're improving the ability to allocate capital. So you're automatically improving ROI. And I believe that the ways that plays out is not just in it's not just in a linear improvement in terms of finding better places to allocate capital. I also take the example of Shane, where traditional fashion used to work in a model where you would study the market, create a seasonal collection, and make large bets, and then wait for data on a long scale. But Shane uses predictive AI to constantly learn from the market, run short micro batches, test them in the market, and then scale up or scale down specific styles on the basis of that. So it's not just reducing uncertainty at the level of individual decisions. It's reducing uncertainty by creating a learning engine that's progressively improving the ability to make better decisions as it moves forward. So that's one example, where we need to rethink how we see the ROI on AI. So that's predictive AI. But even when we think about LLMs and agents today, the way I think about the advantage over there is that the value of LLMs and agents will play out less in terms of, are you able to do translation faster or note taking faster, and more in terms of, are you able to manage institutional knowledge across workflows better? And the reason that's important is because I talk about this idea of a coordination tax. There's organizations struggle from a coordination tax. There's too much time spent getting teams aligned, getting workflows aligned. And if AI can be used, the current LLMs and agents can be used to improve that by improving the ability to manage organizational knowledge. That's an unlock that we haven't yet seen. But more importantly, we're also seeing a shift from siloed execution to workflow governance. And the best example to illustrate this is actually the distinction between Adobe and Figma. So Adobe is really good at siloed execution to help designers make better designs, but Figma manages governance of design at an organization-wide scale. And it can do so because it is cloud first, AI first, and Adobe is not. So even though Adobe uses cloud as a channel and AI as a co-pilot, it's not able to manage workflow governance. And so that shift...
And just to jump in, what can you define what you mean by workflow governance?
Yeah, what I mean by that is that, in this specific case, just to make it very real, design is not an isolated activity. It's an input into product, sales, marketing workflow across the organization. And so from an organizational perspective, you don't just want design to look good, you want it to look consistent, on brand, and aligned across the organization. And the only way to do that is to govern it. Now, the reason that governance is natural to Figma is because Adobe manages design at the level of a file. Figma manages it at the level of an element. So you can manage individually what a button looks like across the organization and have that as a centrally addressable element across the organization. And that's possible because Figma is cloud first. And the reason I'm mentioning this is that the shift to cloud and then the shift to AI is progressively moving us from value in execution alone to value in governance. And that's where I believe a lot of value will accrue with enterprise adoption of AI as well. And that's not being seen yet.
And when you talk like this, I'm thinking about my own company. I run a company as well. Lots of people, and so when you talk about moving away from what this system change allows you to do is to move away from siloed pieces of knowledge. There's coordination tax across the organization. So in our case, we have a sales team, we have a research team, we have a tech team, we have engineers, and so we have meetings, weekly meetings where we discuss things, and things often get lost in translation and things like that. So that you could say this is kind of the mess of an organization, you could say. So in an example like that, what does the new world look like?
Well, the new world, first of all, involves much less time wasted in aligning across teams and different parts of the organization. And the way we align across teams is we create a lot of supporting information in terms of documentation, etc. We get into meetings. We create we create all these artifacts through which other teams can get access to knowledge. But if AI can be used to create an institutional brain, and there are many companies that are trying to build that for the customers. The winners haven't been sorted out yet, but we're headed in that direction where if AI can be used to manage a lot of this unstructured information, which was difficult for machines to read in the past, but is available for machines to read now. And if you can combine that with agentic execution, which again we are seeing in silos where an agent can read your email and hence draft responses on that basis and then retain that memory across the conversation. But if we can do that at institutional scale and not just here's how to follow up with your prospect better, then you're solving that whole coordination tax across the organization. That then frees up cognitive capacity to focus more on innovation. But it also shows through immediately on anything that's slowing down products releases, anything that's slowing down customer support and hence leading to customer churn. So it starts showing through immediately in those metrics if that coordination tax can be resolved.
And so something like the meeting, I mean, the dreaded meeting that seems to plague every organization, people have talked about, you should force everyone to stand up in the meeting so that it's shorter and, having timers to see how long people are speaking. I mean, is there a role for a meeting, whether it's online or in person? I mean, what's or will they all disappear going forward?
I think that's a raw no for everyone. I think we can all agree that there are way more meetings than we need at this point, right? And a lot of it is because we don't have a good way to coordinate. So there will still be a role for meetings because there's only so much you can systematize and coordinate using AI alone. There will still be a role for meetings because despite the best implementation, generative AI does hallucinate. And so depending on the risk associated with a particular choice and the dollar impact associated with that choice, you might want to trust the institutional brain, or you might want to get into a room and have that meeting. So there'll still be those aspects involved. It all comes down to risk and ROI at the end of the day.
Yeah. And you touched on data. So within the organization, there's data, the unstructured, messy data, and it's located sort of differently. So that's one form of data, you could say, sort of internal data. Then there's external data or client-facing data. So you mentioned Shein, who have certain awareness of trends or micro trends that are occurring. TikTok, were able to sort of detect sort of behavioral changes and so on. So, and kind of based on all of that, there's this notion that data is the new oil or the gold or whatever you want to call it. And many people are thinking in those terms that the ultimate edge is data. And do you agree with that or not?
Well, I think, if we really look at what's happened over the last 20 years, the ultimate edge has always been in creating a new architecture of advantage using data. And I'll give a few examples to illustrate that. A simple way to think about it is how, e-commerce companies in general have used data towards fulfillment. So think of three different waves of different types of data being used to create different architectures. And that's where, the point of architectures comes through. When Netflix competed with Blockbuster, a lot of people thought that the role of data was that it was helping with personalization because Netflix knew what you were, queuing, and hence it could recommend better movies. But the thing is that Blockbuster could do that as well, and eventually it did do that. What helped Netflix compete with Blockbuster was that it was able to create or orient its inventory management system around this data in a way that based on the queuing data, it could move DVDs across the country based on where they were likely to be demanded next. And so it was able to manage local demand or fulfill local demand with national inventory. So the DVD utilization rate and the DVD was much higher. The DVD idling rate, that is, it's not out to the customer, was much lower. On the other hand, Blockbuster could only serve local demand with local supply because that's how its whole supply chain had been built. It was fundamentally, every local store managing its community and people driving to the store and working off that. So what
That's
helped
interesting. So
Netflix.
it's almost like one of the innovations of Netflix was their weirdly inventory management,
So that was
more than just
precisely
recommendations.
that was actually the reason Netflix beat Blockbuster. It's not very commonly understood. That was actually their main, their main competitive advantage over Blockbuster that could not be copied, which was, ironically also what makes their shift to streaming so impressive, because they lost that entire advantage when moving to streaming. But it was very much the inventory management, and we see that with Amazon as well. When Amazon came up, traditional retailers could not compete with Amazon because fulfillment to the home requires a fundamentally different fulfillment model. You need to manage returns. You need to manage the variability of different types of home, different types of interfaces. Is there a dog or not? And so managing that level of variability with the tiny margins on fulfillment that is typically there on retail was cost prohibitive for the other companies, which were structured around much more standardized hub and spoke models, trucks moving into the back of a large box store and so on. And so they were never able to compete. So my point in all this is that these companies created supply side architectures based on demand side data. It was not the demand side data that was the moat. It was the combination of the demand side data with the supporting supply side architecture. And we're starting to see this with with AI as well, where in a lot of industries we're seeing that it is the ability to change how a business learns and reorients its supply chain in response to demand side data. And Shane is actually a very good example of that, because Shane or Sheen, whichever way we pronounce it, what it does is it captures data from social media, and on the basis of that, it constantly improves its ability to capture more of the design the design variability into its algorithm and really break it down to simple tasks for designers. So it captures more of the design aesthetic and the ability to determine what will work versus not into the algorithm. And eventually it breaks down the design for micro batches, which can then be tested very quickly. So and that helps it to keep improving. So it's not the data that it's capturing. Anybody can capture that data from out there. It's the architecture that they've built around that data.
That's a great point there. And I guess one thing that follows on from that then is that there's a sense at the moment. I'm thinking now in terms of which winners and losers. And there's a sense that. At the moment, at least, when you look at the performance of equity markets, that these hyperscalers, the Microsofts, the Googles, and obviously the Nvidias, the guys who are building the infrastructure are going to be the big winners. But then at the same time, when I listen to you, it sounds almost like the winners will be the people that will re-architect their firms in a way where they utilize AI in the right way, which is this more efficient capital allocation within the company, use AI to re-architect the supply side of their firm, and such. So, how should we think about winners and losers here?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think there's also a temporal aspect over here in terms of which of those theses play out when, and I think that's the real challenge over here for investors, because at this point, the reason a lot of people are betting on infrastructure is because they don't know what's going to play out about it. So irrespective of that, infrastructure is going to play out well. Now, there's a separate question in terms of whether that bet is overinflated and whether what's going to happen about it is going to play out fast enough before that infrastructure gets depreciated and so on. But setting that aside, there are two or three factors that we can see from nearly 20 years of the digital economy. The first is that it's very rare for highly specialized, highly focused companies doing only one thing to succeed and win in the long run. Typically, the companies that win in the digital economy are the ones who do selective integration. So they selectively vertically integrate across different parts of the value chain, and they try to then commoditize the rest of the ecosystem. And all the big tech are very good examples of that. Amazon commoditizing its suppliers, but then integrating across the advertising capabilities, the fulfillment capabilities, and the marketplace and Prime. Or you look at Google, it does the same thing with publishing. So this idea of selective vertical integration is really important. That's the first point I would say, which then makes me, side with the players who are already doing it well. The big tech are already doing it well, and they know that playbook and they can apply it to AI. They're already applying it to AI. It also works very well because the big tech are able to also move horizontally into the really small niche players, which were relatively immune in the past. A very good example of this is, when we had contact centers, there were SaaS players who would provide contact center as a service software to these contact centers, so for call center management. But increasingly, with AI agents taking support calls, you have companies like Amazon now moving into the same space with Amazon Connect. So AI allows companies to both horizontally expand into these niches, which were not possible to in the past or not profitable enough for them to get into, and vertically selectively integrate. So that's one thing where I would say that whether it's the big tech or even if it's players like Stripe and financial services, for instance, who are well positioned, who have already been selectively integrating across the stack, they're well positioned to use AI. The second thing is, the second set of winners and losers will be determined by those who reimagine, to your point, how you compete using AI. And the example that I take in the book is, TikTok versus Instagram and YouTube, because by the time TikTok came out, Instagram and YouTube were already really big. Wall Street had declared that it was impossible for somebody new to come and compete with them. But then Instagram and YouTube were structured on the logic of a social graph. And on that logic, a new player could not come because there was no way you could convince all the users to move with their entire network and rebuild the network elsewhere. But TikTok allowed a social network to be created using AI without needing a social graph by, creating those learning cycles so that it was tracking every single thing that you were doing on the interface, how you were watching the video, making the video smaller, and with that creating what I call over the behavior graph. And so that idea where you fundamentally change the logic of the industry and you reorient it with a learning advantage, whether it's TikTok or whether it's Shein, in both these cases, we see that the traditional model did not have a learning advantage, but the AI-oriented, AI-first model had a fundamentally new learning advantage. So I think that's something that we are still missing. And the third point that I'll just talk about is, I wrote an HBR article yesterday where I make the distinction between Kodak and Shutterstock, how Kodak responded to the rise of the digital camera and how Shutterstock is responding to the rise of generative AI-based image generation. So Kodak, did not realize, or it could not move to a world where value was shifting away from printing of photos. So it's not that Kodak did not get into digital cameras. In 2006, 5 years before its bankruptcy, it was the number one seller of digital cameras. But that was never the business. The business was printing. And that business went away when the iPhone came in with its big screen, which did not, you didn't need to print anymore. And then the value moved to sharing and then to advertising, and Instagram won. Kodak essentially lost not because of not moving to the digital camera, which it had invented in 1975, which everybody talks about. It lost because printing went away. So Kodak, could never recover from that. But if you look at Shutterstock, it has had a different response to the rise of AI-driven image generation. And I think that's, a third interesting point to keep note of in terms of which companies will reinvent versus not. Because not everybody can, start from scratch like a TikTok did against Facebook, but everybody can do what a Shutterstock did. So what they did was they assumed that you don't need to, your traditional business was set up around the assumption of scarcity of photos. And so having high quality stock photos was valuable. But now that scarcity goes away. So you have to now restructure your business based around the abundance of photos. And when you have an abundance of photos, the constraint shifts to managing the governance of photos inside companies. So when companies are using different types of photos, even if they're AI generated versus not, the constraint shifts to managing, governance of photos in a scenario where some photos are coming from human artists, some photos that are being AI generated. How do you manage that governance of data rights across of IP rights across the whole company. But at the same time, it's working with OpenAI to train the models using its photo libraries. So it's ensuring that the right compensation goes back to the artist as well. And so what it's really looking to do is reimagine what are the positions it should take across the playing field based on the new assumption that photos are not going to be scarce anymore. So I think that's my key point, that a lot of value will come through companies who reimagine this successfully and well. And most other stock photo companies are not doing that. They're still focused on fighting with generative AI, which is a losing battle.
And then at the more micro level, in terms of jobs, there's this big focus on white collar jobs. Lawyers are going to lose their jobs, programmers and so on, designers. But in your book, you talk about above the algorithm and below the algorithm workers. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. I think one of the key distinctions that we're beginning to see is the distinction between an above the algorithm worker and a below the algorithm worker. So a good way to understand this is Uber. The Uber data scientist who designs the algorithms for Uber works above the algorithm. So they get to design how the Uber algorithm works. But the Uber driver works below the algorithm because their pay, the kind of jobs they get access to, the rides, all of that is determined by the algorithm. So the algorithm is the new manager that determines your wages, it determines your access to new opportunities. And the reason that happens is because with the rise of Google Maps, the tacit knowledge associated with navigating a city, which a highly experienced driver had, and on the basis of which they competed in the past by getting you reliably from source to destination, that knowledge got commoditized. When that got commoditized, what the driver was left with was relatively interchangeable, which is just the ability to drive from point A to point B. So as long as the driver was safe and driving well and the car looked good, cars and drivers were interchangeable, and that's what happens with Uber. And so below the algorithm jobs typically tend to get commoditized and modular and interchangeable. Now, when we think about Uber and delivery and these use cases, it seems obvious, but one of my key points is that this is beginning to happen to knowledge work as well, because what AI does is what Google Maps did to driving, AI does to a lot of knowledge work. Even when we augment ourselves, if AI takes over, if we augment ourselves with AI, and that enables, with AI augmentation, that enables lesser trained workers to now compete at the same level as higher trained workers, the differential value of that training goes away. And so there's also, because of that, there's an increasing pressure on wages because the number of people competing for the same skill that they are providing has dramatically increased. And that's what we are beginning to see in a lot of knowledge work as well. After I wrote the book, I started getting emails from people who were in paid social advertising, who were essentially saying that a lot of what we did over the last 7 years has now been absorbed into the algorithm. So the level of discretion we have has dramatically gone down. And because the discretion, which was our judgment, is now in the algorithm, at the age of 40, we are now having to compete with a 22-year-old who's going to charge, who's happy with a salary that's 1/3 of ours. And so we're essentially priced out of the market completely. So it's beginning to happen to knowledge work as well. And that's the key point, that as AI improves, it takes on the ability to perform more forms of knowledge work. It may not be able to perform it entirely, but what matters is that it performs it enough so that the remaining part that you perform becomes interchangeable and modular, and hence you are essentially part of this below the algorithm workforce.
And I mean, if we take a profession like law or medicine, who would be above the algorithm there? Because is it, would it be somebody who's very experienced, like a partner at a law firm who has, certain management capabilities and obviously certain legal knowledge, who'd be above the algorithm, and then they're working with a computer scientist, no doubt, establish the algorithms, and then all the sort of trainee lawyers or the associate lawyers would essentially become below the algorithm. I mean, how do we think of it in terms of established organizations?
Yeah.
The reason I say this is because if you look at the economic labor market data over the past year, it seems like young people are struggling to get jobs, 20-somethings,
right,
coming out of college.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if that's related to something like this or not.
Yeah, I think, what's happening in the job market is explainable both by the immediate effects of automation and hence hesitation to invest too much in labor, but also with the larger progressive effects of what I call commoditization, which is moving people from above the algorithm to below the algorithm as AI improves. And I think that's going to happen increasingly as we move forward. To your point about, taking a profession like law, I talk about certain aspects, or I won't call them skills, but certain aspects associated with a role that allow you to retain a position above the algorithm. One is your ability to bear risk. Are you bearing risk for the execution, or are you only executing? Because the ability to execute can increasingly be taken up by AI, but the ability to stand and assume risk with what has been created will become more valuable than ever as more and more people have the ability to execute. Now, the ability to take risk also helps you capture the value creating relationship on the basis of which you charge. So the lawyer, the partner at the law firm has that relationship with the client because they are the ones taking the risk, and hence retaining the relationship because they are establishing trust by managing the risk. Whereas a junior lawyer is just executing and is not managing the risk, and hence does not have access to that relationship and trust as well. The other piece alongside this is the importance of narrative control, whether it is law firms or whether it is an engineer who has a podcast on the side and also an influencer on LinkedIn. These players are successful not just because they have experience, not just because they are good at executing and at taking risks, but also because they have narrative control. They're shaping what they stand for. They are signaling that we know our stuff, you should be working with us. And so these inevitably above the algorithm roles will go not just to people who are really good at managing or creating algorithms and understanding these systems, but also those who are good at managing the risk, trust, and narrative control. So those those issues are important. Below the algorithm, I think there's a vicious cycle, which is that if you're never able to learn enough to move above the algorithm, you keep getting caught in modular tasks below the algorithm, which means in the past, I might have, moved up the pyramid at a law firm, but today, if I don't get that job, I'm going to go into a freelancer marketplace and I'm going to, raise my hand as I'm going to, verify your AI generated drafts, or I'm going to, do some kind of a modular task. The more I get stuck in doing those modular tasks, the more as AI improves around me, the scope of my modular tasks progressively becomes smaller, and the number of people who can compete with me progressively becomes larger. And so that's the challenge with below the algorithm work.
And if a policymaker is listening to this, and we do have several policymakers listening to this, let's say you're a central bank governor or something, or a finance minister or something, or even a prime minister or something. I mean, what advice would you give them in terms of how to think about policy?
Well, I think, some of our traditional tools of policy are not going to be as effective as they used to be. The simple, relationship between I would say employment and wages and prices, that relationship breaks down above the algorithm versus below the algorithm. It's potentially you can see a lot of employment below the algorithm, but that could end up being deflationary just for all the reasons that I just mentioned. So looking at employment and the presence of a job as an indicator of well-being for the worker is not going to suffice. The second thing is that even as we learn to navigate this algorithmic economy, we need to be very clear about how we regulate these algorithms, because different algorithmic systems give different levels of agency to the worker. A simple example to just drive this home is, think of the difference between Airbnb and Uber. Both of them have a 5-star rating system, but on Airbnb, the 5-star rating system helps you earn more. The better you perform, the higher you can charge, the more you show up higher up in search results, and the travelers trust you, so you can charge higher. On Uber, no matter what your star rating, your wage is determined by the algorithm. So when we regulate these systems, we need to make these distinctions. To what extent is the algorithm taking the agency away from the worker versus not? So I think that's a second piece that's important. A third piece that's important is just understanding that value, there's no doubt that the pie is going to increase. The question is not that whether we are zero sum or positive sum. We all agree. I think an overwhelming majority understands that AI is going to increase the pie. The problem is, how does the pie get distributed? And in the past, the mechanism for distribution was institutional mechanisms like collective bargaining, etc. Today, what policymakers still don't understand is that the mechanism for distribution is how you modularize these jobs and make them progressively more commoditized. And so that is basically, what I would call is that is you change the architecture of work completely. And it's no longer about collective bargaining. It's no longer about creating static institutions that can work on your behalf. It's about regulating how the structure of work changes as technology improves. And I don't think policymakers understand that yet. And a very simple way to drive home that point is, I mentioned two examples over here: Adobe versus Figma, and TikTok versus Facebook. Both of them were investigated by antitrust lawyers, and the verdict was very different in the two cases. Adobe versus Figma was seen as anti-competitive. Facebook versus TikTok was not seen as anti-competitive, because Facebook versus TikTok was seen as a fundamentally new way to compete using the behavior graph. But Adobe versus Figma was also that. As I mentioned, it went from execution to workflow governance, but that was not fully understood. So we need to have a more cohesive and consistent understanding of how these systems work, because that is how we'll be able to regulate the second and third order effects.
And then what advice would you give to management of companies? Again, we have people who are CEOs of companies, management of companies. And what advice would you give them?
Yeah, I think the central advice, which is the central message of my book and the HBR article that came out yesterday, is just this: that tool adoption is only giving you a ticket to a game that's becoming obsolete. So you'll get better at playing the game while others around you change the game and figure out new ways to win, and you get caught in their game. So tool adoption is not going to help you. 95% of Gen AI projects fail. That does not matter. When people hear that, execs automatically say, how can we be the remaining 5%? And that's the wrong question, because maybe those projects are not even the right projects because they're focused on tool adoption. You should be focusing on reinvention. So unless your projects and pilots are focused on reinventing your business, think of Shutterstock. It reinvented itself based on the new realities of the playing field. It did not try to compete against or continue to assume that stock photos would be scarce. It assumed that stock photos were going to be abundant, and the scarcity of photos is going away, or access to photos is going to be abundant. So then how do you reimagine where you play, how you win on the basis of that? So I think that's the most important thing. AI is going to change your playing field, your industry boundaries, the companies you compete with, as I mentioned, with Amazon Connect versus contact center as a service players. But what's important is how you reorient your view of what game you're playing and what it'll take to win.
And I know you have advised financial sector companies as well. I mean, do you have is there some specific challenges that the financial sector will face, or will it lead to more bundling, unbundling? Is this about companies having to become kind of more AI centric, or is there something about the financial sector that you can comment on?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are two or three things that come to mind. One is that ever since the rise of open banking, the last 10 years or so, in particular, we've seen these cycles of unbundling and what I call rebundling, right? And what we've seen, and what's backed by basic economic theory here as well, is that unbundling disrupts the status quo. It throws the incumbents in a quandary, but it does not create new sustainable business models. In order to create new sustainable business models, you have to rebundle. And if you look at most of the fintechs that eventually succeeded, whether it's Stripe or Plaid or Square, they started with solving a simple problem, but then they rebundled and captured more of the workflow. So the first thing is that unbundling in itself is a short-term intermediary state, you will have to think about what is the new way you rebundle. And the new bundle is very different from the old bundle. So you'll see fundamentally new business models on that basis. And that's also the central argument of the book as well. The second point that I like to make is that in the early, I would say had we've had digital transformation play out in progressive waves. So till the early 2010s or the late 2000s, most of the shifts in the digital economy played out near the customer interface, whether it was first, with the distribution advantages of the internet, then with the rise of the social web, then with the rise of smartphones, it was all in organizing markets around the customer interface. In the mid 2010s, and especially in financial services, most of the impact of digital technologies started playing out across the rest of the value chain as we started seeing capabilities getting modularized, banks opening up APIs, working with other banks. And what happens when we talk about modularization of the value chain in that way, where individual capabilities start competing and interoperating, is that individual capabilities eventually get commoditized. You can't compete just on the basis of, we offer the best KYC. It eventually gets commoditized. The way you compete then is by rebundling those capabilities to solve fundamentally new customer workflows that did not exist in the past. And simple examples are serving financial services like a specialized lending product into an e-commerce workflow at the point of checkout, right? That's essentially, you could provide that as a simple API call, or you could create an entire workflow and provide that, and then by rebundling across a larger workflow, you have a better chance of winning. And with AI, that's becoming more interesting because individual capabilities will continue to get commoditized. So if you're just thinking about, let's open up APIs and set up an API marketplace, that'll end up getting commoditized. But with AI, you can do intelligent bundles, intelligent workflows by stringing together your capabilities and adding an AI layer on top of that, and then providing that as a bundled workflow embedded into somebody else's system. So my key point over here is that this idea of embedded finance happened because of the modularization of the value chain. That's not going away. But we're going to move away from static embeddings, stepwise workflows, to intelligent agentic embeddings. And I think that's going to be a significant driver of value creation. The final point I'll just make is, if you look at companies like Stripe and Ramp, there's an interesting architectural shift that we see with those companies, which makes them AI first. So Stripe helps you manage payments with external players. Ramp helps you manage expenses internally. Both of them are examples of the Adobe versus Figma distinction that I talked about. So Figma, you could manage design at the element level rather than at the file level. Stripe and Ramp manage governance of transactions at the transaction level rather than at the accounts level or at the expense report level. So while traditional software players managed expense reports or managed accounting, managed taxes, Stripe can do all of those things because it manages the transaction and then it rebundles transactions into expense reports, into tax reports, and so on. And so this fundamentally new architectural shift is something that's still playing out, which people don't yet see. And I think there's a lot of value that will be created over there.
Yeah, that's great. Now, I did want to round off with a few more more personal questions. One is, and I guess this is actually related to our larger conversation. We do have some youngsters listening to the podcast as well. People who are about to graduate from university or will graduate later on in the academic year. What advice would you give to youngsters as they enter the real world?
Yeah, I think it's I will acknowledge that it's a difficult time to enter the real world. And the reason is not AI, the reason is uncertainty. And AI is one of the factors that creates that uncertainty. But it's, if somebody's saying it's only AI, they're just using it as an excuse. This uncertainty is going to increase because of the convergence of different forces that are shaping, how work is done. And the way to then counter that uncertainty is, first of all, have more agency over your own career, because the traditional institutional, crucibles or containers which would manage your career are going away. So that's the first thing is, work is getting more interconnected. It's going to get more modular. You'll have to plug in. You'll have to have a portfolio career if you don't have agency over your career, nobody else will help you plan it. That's the first thing. In order to have agency over your career, you need to answer the difficult question of what do I like and what am I good at, which we've always had to answer. But at the same time, you have to answer another difficult question of what's going to be relevant based on how things are changing. So you have to keep an eye on the system and keep an eye on how is your industry changing, where are your skills valued versus not, what are complementary skills that are increasingly getting valued, how can you bundle those skills in ways that keep you valuable enough. And the third thing is then to really constantly have this, constantly ask yourself, what is my industry going to look like a year from now, and what kind of, what should I be doing at that point to stay relevant? Ask yourself this, always ask yourself by pitting yourself out 1 year. It's not short enough that it doesn't account for the change, but it's not long enough that it becomes very vague. But then keep asking that question every month. What has changed? Do I still believe in the vision that I have for myself? So my point is that while it's important to learn the tools, don't get stuck and caught in tool adoption, because everybody will do that, and eventually the gains from that will not come to you. You'll end up in some kind of a below the algorithm position if you just focus entirely on tool adoption. You have to keep looking out for how can I reimagine, reinvent myself based on what the playing field will be like and what will help me stay relevant in that playing field.
Now, you're an author of several books, including this latest book, Reshuffle. Are there some books that really influence you over your career?
Well, I think different books for different aspects, right? So obviously, I'm a writer, so I like reading books by people who manage prose very well and who are good at storytelling. There was a time when I used to love lapping up Woody Allen's plays. Just the way he handles, the speed of dialogue, the rhythm of dialogue is very interesting. And so there are many on that side, on the prose side. In terms of content, I am less somebody who tries to keep abreast of every nuance of the latest technology, and more somebody who asks what's not going to change, because that is compounding benefits. Because if you know what's not going to change, and I think how systems work, how socio-technical systems work, what elements of a technology to look at to determine how it will get adopted and how economic activity will reorganize around it. If you can start sharpening those heuristics, they stay constant beyond individual technological shifts. And so that helps you not keep jumping from being a blockchain expert to becoming an AI expert and so on, because that's there's no compounding benefit over there, and you're constantly on this hamster wheel. But because of that, I end up reading a lot of systems thinking. I end up reading a lot of books around how things work at an economic level. I read a lot of books about power and the history of power, economic history in general. And I think all of that shows through in the stories that I use in the book as well. And there are 3 or 4 books that, inspired Reshuffle, and I'm happy to point those out. One is The Box by Mark Levinson, which talks about how the container shaped the world. I think it's a brilliant book, even if you don't want to know about the container, but just to know how the world works and how things work. It's a brilliant book from that perspective. More theoretically, there were 2 or 3 other books that really helped. One was a book called Design Rules, which talks about how systems change at a very abstract and technical level. There's a book called Clock Speed, which talks about how different parts of the value chain morph when the pace of innovation is different at different levels. And that's what we're seeing with AI today. And so I borrow a lot from that book as well, because the rate of change in heavily capitalized model layers is much higher than the rate of change in human, slow, bureaucratic layers on top, the companies that are using those models. And yeah, I think these are some of the books that come to mind.
No, that's fantastic. Now, finally, what's the best way for people to learn more about your work, to reach out to you and so on?
Yeah, I write a newsletter almost every week. It's available at platforms.substack.com. So it's the plural platforms.substack.com. And you can reach out at my website platform thinkinglabs.com and reshufflebook.com.
That's great. I'll include links to all of those on the show notes. So with that, Sangeet, this is fantastic. It's really been a really fun and interesting conversation, and good luck with all of your work.
Thank you so much, Bilal. It was such a pleasure. I really enjoyed it, and thank you again.
Thanks for listening to this episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating, a nice comment, and let other people know about the show. We'll be very, very grateful. And of course, sign up for our free newsletter at macrohive.com. And this podcast is not intended to be investment research, nor does it constitute financial, economic, legal, tax, or accounting advice. This podcast is provided for information purposes only and does not constitute an offer or solicitation to purchase or sell any financial instruments. The contents of this podcast are not based on your individual circumstances and should not be relied upon as an assessment of suitability for you of a particular product, security, or transaction. The information in this podcast is based on generally available information and although obtained from sources believed by MacroHive to be reliable, its accuracy and completeness are not guaranteed. Past performance is not guarantee or indication of future results. Third-party opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the speaker and do not represent the views of MacroHive, BGC Group, or any of its affiliates. And this podcast may not be copied or distributed in whole or in part without the express written consent of MacroHive. All rights are reserved.